A routine bank visit turns into a shocking confrontation when Clint Eastwood is humiliated by an arrogant teller, until Barron Trump walks in. The young Trump's fierce response leaves the entire bank in stunned silence. What happens next is unforgettable. Watch as Barron takes a stand for respect, justice, and the truth in a way no one expected. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The Grand Oaks Bank was bustling that morning, its polished floors reflecting the glow of crystal chandeliers, its air thick with the scent of fresh coffee and freshly printed dollar bills. The faint hum of banking transactions filled the space, keyboards clicking, papers shuffling, and the occasional sigh of an impatient customer. Tellers greeted clients with forced smiles, their professionalism as polished as the marble countertops they stood behind. Among them was Godson, a young and sharp-faced teller who had mastered the art of arrogance. She lived for the small moments of control she had over customers, choosing who deserved patience and who didn't, who got a polite smile and who got a dismissive glance. To her, power wasn't about wealth or status, it was about who she could make feel small. Then, the double glass door swung open, and in walked Clint Eastwood. At 94 years old, he wasn't just a man, he was a living legend, a face known across generations, a symbol of grit, resilience, and American storytelling. But Clint wasn't here to relive his Hollywood glory. He wasn't here for attention or applause. He was just a man running an errand, looking to withdraw some cash and go about his day. His step, though slower than in his younger days, still held the firm determination of a cowboy who had walked through storms before. His iconic squint scanned the room, taking in the energy, the people, and the subtle stiffness in the air that always accompanied banks, where money was both a source of power and anxiety. A young boy in line nudged his father, whispering in awe, "Dad, that's Clint Eastwood." The father smiled but didn't interrupt. Even in a world obsessed with fleeting celebrity moments, Clint Eastwood commanded a different kind of respect, the kind that didn't need words to be felt. But not everyone recognized or cared about who he was. When Clint finally reached the front of the line, Karen barely lifted her eyes from her screen. The brief glance she did give him was the same one she reserved for people she found inconvenient, slow, and unimportant. With a deep, exaggerated sigh, she clicked her manicured nails against the counter and muttered, "What do you need, sir?" Clint remained calm, unfazed by the lack of courtesy. He had seen it all. True villains, both in movies and in life. This was nothing. His voice was steady, low but firm, the same voice that had delivered some of the most iconic lines in film history. Just a small withdrawal. Karen finally looked at his ID, her brow arching as she read the name. And then, a smirk curled under her lips. "Clint Eastwood," she mused, her voice carrying just enough disbelief to draw the attention of nearby employees. "Didn't know you were still alive." Laughter rippled through a few tellers behind her. It wasn't loud, but it was enough. Enough to feel like a punch of humiliation to anyone on the receiving end of it. Karen didn't stop there. She tapped the keyboard lazily, dragging the transaction along with deliberate slowness. The bank's energy shifted. Some customers shifted uncomfortably, while others simply watched, unsure if they were witnessing a rude joke or something far worse. Clint didn't react. He had nothing to prove to people like her. He simply waited. And that's when she crossed the line. As Clint reached for his money, Karen suddenly slapped his hand away, her voice sharp with impatience. "Hey, old man, move it along." The sound of the slap echoed through the vast marble halls. It was as sharp as a gunshot, piercing the bank's usual hum of transactions and casual conversations. The room froze. Every movement, every sound, stopped. A gasp escaped from an elderly woman nearby. A young man gripping his checkbook blinked in disbelief. Even Karen's fellow employees, who had laughed just moments ago, stiffened. Clint's hand hovered in the air, stunned. Not by pain, but by the sheer audacity of it. In his lifetime, he had taken on outlaws, gangsters, and ruthless lawmen on screen, but never had he been so openly disrespected in real life. His jaw clenched, his piercing blue eyes darkening, and in that moment, Karen had just made the biggest mistake of her life. The silence inside Grand Oaks Bank stretched on, thick and suffocating. The slap had done more than just echo through the marble halls. It had sent a shockwave through the room. Customers and employees alike stood frozen, their gazes darting between Clint Eastwood, the man who had spent decades crafting tales of justice, and Karen Dawson, who now stood with a sneer of arrogance that was quickly melting into something else. Discomfort, uncertainty, fear. Clint didn't move. He simply withdrew his hand, staring at Karen with the kind of piercing, steely gaze that had made villains in his films sweat bullets. But Karen wasn't a movie villain. She wasn't even aware of who she had just insulted. She only saw an old man, one she had no patience for, one who wasn't worth her time. She exhaled dramatically, rolling her eyes. "Next in line," she called out, dismissing Clint as if he were nothing. A few bank employees exchanged nervous glances. A customer, an elderly man wearing a Vietnam veteran's hat, clenched his jaw. The young boy who had recognized Clint earlier tugged on his father's sleeve, whispering, "Dad, why did she do that?" His father, lips pressed into a tight line, didn't answer. Then the doors swung open. It was subtle at first. A hush fell over the murmuring crowd, a shift in energy, an unspoken presence that sent a ripple through the room. Two large men in black suits entered first, their movements smooth and calculated. Their sharp eyes swept over the room with the precision of trained professionals, standing at attention just a few feet from the entrance. And then he walked in. Barron Trump. At 18 years old, Barron was no longer the quiet child America once knew. He had grown into a towering, confident young man, his stride purposeful, composed, unwavering. He carried himself with the same commanding presence as his father, Donald J. Trump, the newly sworn-in 47th President of the United States. His icy blue eyes scanned the bank with an intensity that made the room feel 10 degrees colder. For a brief moment, no one spoke. The whispers started almost immediately. "That's Barron Trump. The president's son? What's he doing here?" Karen, still standing behind the counter, exhaled through her nose, unimpressed. To her, he was just another customer, another name, another transaction that would keep her from finishing her shift on time. She barely spared him a glance before muttering under her breath, "Oh great, another one." Barron's eyes, sharp and unblinking, locked onto Clint Eastwood. He saw the red mark on his godfather's hand. He saw the way customers were frozen in place, their expressions a mix of shock and unease. He saw Karen standing tall, still oblivious to the disaster she had just created for herself. His jaw tightened. The two security agents behind him straightened, stepping forward slightly in anticipation. One of them, a tall man with an earpiece and a no-nonsense expression, cleared his throat and took a step toward Karen. "Watch your tone," he warned, his voice even but laced with authority. Karen barely blinked. "Excuse me?" she scoffed, crossing her arms. "And who exactly do you think you are?" Barron raised a hand, silencing his guard. He didn't need anyone to speak for him. He took a step forward, his voice calm, steady, and unmistakably authoritative. "I'm Barron Trump." Karen finally looked at him. Something in her face changed, like a switch being flipped. Barron didn't stop there. His voice remained measured, but there was an unmistakable sharpness beneath it. "And Clint Eastwood is my godfather." The shift in the room was instantaneous. The weight of those words hit like a tidal wave. The air grew heavier, the atmosphere thicker with unspoken tension. Customers gasped. The bank employees stiffened, their laughter dying mid-throat. Karen paled. The whispers exploded into frantic murmurs, some customers now discreetly pulling out their phones to record the unfolding moment. It was no longer just a banking mishap. This was about to become national news. Karen swallowed hard, her bravado cracking. She had just slapped Clint Eastwood, a legend, and now the son of the most powerful man in the world was standing before her, demanding an answer. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Barron turned to Clint, his expression softening slightly. "Are you okay?" Clint, still standing tall, nodded. His voice was calm, but there was an edge of something deeper, something unspoken but powerful. "Takes more than that to shake me, kid." Barron turned back to Karen, his eyes burning with icy intensity. "You just slapped a legend," he said, his voice sharp. "And you laughed about it." Karen's breathing hitched. The blood had drained from her face entirely, her hands now gripping the counter. Barron took another step forward, towering over her. "Do you have any idea who this man is?" Karen didn't answer. She couldn't. Barron's voice remained calm but commanding, unyielding. "Do you understand the respect he deserves?" The bank stood silent, the only sound being the muffled clicks of phone cameras capturing every second. Karen, once so arrogant, so dismissive, was now nothing more than a shaking mess, her confidence crumbling like a sandcastle caught in a storm. Barron's next words sealed her fate. "You will." The room held its breath. Everyone knew something was about to happen, and whatever it was going to change everything. The atmosphere inside Grand Oaks Bank was now electric with tension, charged like the sky before a violent storm. The customers, employees, and even the security guards stood frozen in place, as if the very air had thickened, pressing against their chests. The weight of Barron Trump's words, spoken with an unshakable authority, hung over the room like an executioner's blade. Karen Dawson, once so smug and dismissive, hadn't moved an inch since the moment Barron identified himself. The arrogance that had once curled her lips into a sneer had drained away entirely. Her hands, once so quick to slap away an old man's, now gripped the counter with white-knuckled desperation. Her mouth opened, then shut. Her gaze darted to the bank manager, a balding man in his late 50s, whose forehead was already glistening with nervous sweat. He looked equally stunned, his face contorted in a mixture of disbelief and panic. This wasn't just a mistake. It was a catastrophe. Karen had slapped Clint Eastwood, a living legend, and disrespected him in front of a bank full of witnesses. But that wasn't the worst of it. She had done it in front of his godson, a man whose last name carried a level of power she could never have imagined dealing with in her life. Barron stood still, his expression unreadable. He wasn't yelling, he wasn't making threats, but that was the terrifying part. Karen knew she was about to face something bigger than she could handle. The bank manager finally found his voice, stepping forward with a forced, trembling smile. Mr. Trump." Barron didn't even glance at him. His eyes remained locked on Karen, unblinking, as if he were staring straight into her soul. "Apologize." The single word, spoken with the weight of undeniable finality, shattered whatever thin veneer of control Karen had left. She sucked in a sharp breath, her chest rising and falling in panicked rhythm. Apologize? To the man she had mocked? The thought twisted inside her like a dagger. It was humiliating, it was unbearable, but she had no choice. Her pride, the same arrogance that had made her roll her eyes and slap Clint's hand, now felt like a dead weight dragging her down. For a long, unbearable moment, she stood there, staring at Clint Eastwood, the legend whose piercing blue eyes now studied her not with anger, but with quiet disappointment. That was worse than rage. She had laughed at him, humiliated him, treated him like nothing. And now, in front of everyone, she had to admit how wrong she was. Her lips trembled as she finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mr. Eastwood, I'm sorry." Clint didn't respond. Karen swallowed hard. That wasn't enough. Her voice wavered as she forced herself to look directly at him. "I shouldn't have treated you that way." The silence in the bank deepened, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for Clint's reaction. The bank manager took a nervous step forward, sensing the moment hanging precariously in the air. "Mr. Eastwood, on behalf of Grand Oaks Bank, I sincerely apologize for what happened today. This was completely unacceptable, and I assure you it does not reflect our values." Barron cut him off with a glance. "Spare me the rehearsed speech." The bank manager visibly flinched, his forced smile faltering. Barron turned back to Karen, his voice steady, controlled. "You don't just get to say I'm sorry and move on. Respect isn't a word, it's an action." Karen's face crumpled. The weight of what she had done, what it meant, and who she had done it to, finally sank in. Her gaze dropped. "I know," she whispered. I wasn't thinking." "No, you were thinking," Barron corrected, stepping closer. "You just didn't think he was worth your respect." A quiet gasp rippled through the customers. Karen shut her eyes tightly, her face burning with humiliation. Barron exhaled slowly, studying her. Then he looked past her to the other employees. "And what about the rest of you?" The laughter, the snickers, the sidelong glances from the other bank employees. They hadn't stood up for Clint either. They had watched, entertained, complicit in his humiliation. Now they squirmed, eyes darting away, unable to meet Barron's gaze. Karen, still trembling, finally forced herself to look back at Clint. She hesitated, then finally took a deep breath. "I was wrong." Clint studied her for a long moment. Then, in a voice as calm as the eye of a storm, he spoke. "You don't get to erase what happened," he said, "but you do get to decide what happens next." The words hit Karen like a hammer. Her throat tightened. Her hands clenched. And in that moment, she understood something she had never considered before. It wasn't just about one slap. It was about every single time she had dismissed someone without a second thought. Every moment she had judged someone too quickly. Every time she had used her position, her authority, her voice, to belittle instead of to serve. She had been the kind of person who saw age as a weakness instead of as a lifetime of wisdom. And now the whole world was watching her realize that. A lump rose in her throat. She had made the biggest mistake of her life, and she would never make it again. The oppressive silence in Grand Oaks Bank lingered like the final echoes of a gunshot. Karen stood frozen, her once arrogant posture reduced to a slumped shadow of itself. The weight of her humiliation, her exposure, crushed down on her like an avalanche. Clint Eastwood had not yelled, he had not retaliated. Instead, he had done something worse. He had made her confront herself. Barron Trump, standing tall beside his godfather, let the silence do the work. His piercing blue eyes never left Karen's face, but in them there was no gloating, no cruelty, only an expectation, a demand. But this moment, this reckoning, was not over yet. The bank manager, beads of sweat forming at his temples, cleared his throat in a desperate attempt to regain control. "Mr. Trump, Mr. Eastwood, He was interrupted. The heavy doors of the bank swung open violently, slamming against the walls with an unsettling thud. A tall man in a navy moon suit strode in, his polished shoes striking the floor with the precision of a drill sergeant's march. He was flanked by two assistants, their clipboards clutched tightly against their chests, as if bracing for impact. Gerald Whitmore, regional director of Grand Oaks Bank, the man in charge. His expression was unreadable, but there was a distinct tightness to his jaw, a simmering irritation barely masked by professional restraint. His presence sent a fresh wave of whispers through the crowd. Employees tensed, sensing a shift in the balance of power. But power belonged to those who commanded it, not those who assumed it was theirs. Whitmore's sharp hazel eyes scanned the room before locking on to Barron Trump. "Mr. Trump," he said smoothly, his voice clipped and formal, "what exactly is happening here?" Barron didn't move, didn't blink. "You tell me," he said, his tone dangerously measured. Whitmore exhaled sharply through his nose. He turned his gaze to Karen, who looked as small as a cornered mouse, and then to the bank manager, who was visibly wilting under the weight of the moment. "I see," Whitmore muttered. He adjusted his tie, his movements slow, calculated. Then, with a forced smile, He turned back to Clint Eastwood. "Mr. Eastwood, first, let me express my sincerest apologies for the incident that took place here today." Clint studied him, unreadable. Whitmore continued, his voice measured, almost rehearsed. "I assure you this is not how Grand Oaks Bank treats its customers. This," he gestured vaguely toward Karen, "was an isolated incident, and it will be handled appropriately." Handled appropriately. The word sounded sterile, cold, and impersonal, like a damage control press release instead of genuine accountability. Clint remained silent. Barron, however, was done playing games. He took a step forward, his towering frame making Whitmore instinctively stiffen. "That's your response?" Barron's voice, low and sharp, cut through the air like a blade. "An isolated incident?" Whitmore faltered. "Mr. Trump, with all due respect." "Respect?" Barron interrupted. "Your employee disrespected my godfather, mocked him, laid a hand on him, and now? You're trying to package this as an incident?" Whitmore straightened his shoulders, his irritation bubbling beneath the surface. "Mr. Trump, I understand your concern, but—" "No," Barron said firmly. "You don't." The room wasn't breathing. The next words Barron spoke would determine everything. He exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "People like you," he said quietly, "are the reason this keeps happening." Whitmore's eyes flashed. "Excuse me? You let it slide. You dismiss it." Barron's voice was measured, steady, but it carried the force of a hammer blow. "You let employees like Karen treat people like my godfather? Like any elderly citizen? As if they don't matter?" Karen flinched. Barron took another step forward. "And the worst part? You wouldn't have done a damn thing about it if I wasn't standing right here." Whitmore's mouth tightened into a thin line. The room was achingly silent. Then Clint finally spoke. His voice was calm, unshaken, but there was steel beneath it. "You ever been knocked flat on your back, Mr. Whitmore?" The regional director blinked, caught off guard. I have, and let me tell you something." Clint tilted his head slightly. "The ground don't feel much different than it did 50 years ago." A hum of quiet laughter rippled through the crowd, but the meaning was clear. Some lessons need to hurt before they stick. Whitmore's face was a battlefield, caught between frustration and the realization that he was losing control. He glanced at Barron, at Clint, at the dozens of people filming every second of this exchange. Then finally his professional mask cracked. He exhaled sharply, then turned to Karen. "Karen Dawson, you are dismissed. Collect your belongings." Karen's breath hitched, her face crumpling as the weight of those words sank in. It was over. Tears sprang to her eyes, but she didn't argue, didn't protest. She simply nodded stiffly before stepping away from the counter. The bank manager's face paled further. Whitmore, without looking at Barron, exhaled sharply. "There. It's handled." Barron let the silence stretch. Then, with a quiet finality, he spoke. "Not yet." Whitmore, blinking rapidly, looked up sharply. Barron leaned in just slightly, his voice dropping. "You think firing her fixes this?" Whitmore didn't answer. Barron tilted his head. "No. What you're going to do is ensure this never happens again. A real system in place, better training, better policies, and a public statement addressing what happened here." Whitmore's nostrils flared. "That's not how this works." Barron smirked. "It is now." Whitmore glanced at the cameras and the world watching, and then he finally understood. This wasn't just about Clint Eastwood anymore. This was about every customer who had been mistreated, every veteran, every elderly man or woman dismissed as just another old person. Barron Trump had just forced him to be accountable, and there was nothing he could do about it. The crisp afternoon air outside Grand Oaks Bank was eerily still, as if the world itself had hit pause to witness what was about to unfold. A hushed murmur spread through the growing crowd of onlookers, many of whom were still digesting the events that had just taken place inside. Barron Trump and Clint Eastwood stepped through the heavy glass doors, the tension from the bank still clinging to them like an unshakable storm cloud. Clint exhaled sharply, adjusting his jacket. "Kid, I think we made enough of a scene for one day," Clint muttered, his voice gruff but amused. Barron, however, wasn't smiling. His keen eyes swept the street, his instincts telling him that something still wasn't right. There was a weight in the air, something unfinished, unresolved. And then, just as he had suspected, a voice rang out behind them, sharp and authoritative. "Stop right there." Barron turned, his posture unwavering. Standing at the entrance of the bank was a tall, imposing figure, his expression unreadable yet cold. Dressed in a navy new suit, his polished shoes gleamed under the sunlight as he adjusted his tie with practiced arrogance. Gerald Whitmore, not as a regional director making a public apology. No. This was a man fighting to save his own pride. Clint barely lifted an eyebrow. "You again? You want me to open an account or something?" His voice was casual, but there was a razor's edge to it. Whitmore's jaw tightened. His cold gaze didn't waver from Barron. "Let's be clear, Mr. Trump. I don't appreciate the spectacle you made inside my bank." Barron folded his arms. Spectacle? His voice was smooth, but there was a challenge in it. Whitmore took a step closer. The tension between them was a live wire, buzzing with the unspoken war of authority. "You humiliated my employee. You humiliated me," Whitmore said, his voice tight. Barron tilted his head. "No, Mr. Whitmore. She did that herself." The crowd shifted, sensing something big brewing. Whitmore exhaled sharply, clearly trying to rein in his frustration. "Listen, Mr. Trump. You may be the son of the president, but you don't run my bank. You don't dictate how I conduct business." Barron took a deliberate step forward. Though he was still young, he towered over Whitmore, his presence commanding in a way no title or power suit could fake. "Your bank doesn't get to humiliate people and walk away unscathed," Barron said, his voice unshaken, precise. Whitmore scoffed, shaking his head. "You don't understand how the real world works, do you? This is just another headline for you. Tomorrow the news cycle moves on, and we keep running our bank the way we always have." The arrogance, the unapologetic belief that power could erase responsibility. That was Whitmore's fatal mistake. Barron's expression darkened. "You're right about one thing, Whitmore." The man raised an eyebrow. "This won't just be a headline tomorrow. It's going to be a movement." Whitmore's smirk faltered. "Excuse me?" Barron turned slightly, gesturing toward the crowd. Phones were still raised, cameras rolling. The entire world was watching. "Do you see them?" Barron's voice dropped just slightly, but somehow it carried even stronger. "They're not just here for me or Clint. They're here because they've seen this happen before. Maybe to their parents, maybe to their neighbors, maybe to themselves. And today, we're making sure people remember it." Whitmore opened his mouth, but no words came out. Because for the first time, he understood. He wasn't just facing a rich young man defending his godfather. He was facing a storm, one he couldn't control. Barron wasn't looking for an apology anymore. He was looking for change. Clint, who had been quietly watching, let out a low whistle. "Well, son, I'd say you've got him in a tight spot now." Barron smirked. "I'd say so." Whitmore's mask of confidence finally cracked. He could already see the damage forming. His bank's name trending on social media, customers threatening to close their accounts, reporters swarming for a statement. And then came the final blow. Barron pulled out his phone, tapped the screen a few times, then turned it around, showing Whitmore exactly what had already happened. A tweet from the official account of the President of the United States. No one, not even American icons like Clint Eastwood, should be treated with such disrespect. This isn't just about one man, it's about how we value all people. Time for real accountability. At Real Donomic. Whitmore stared at the screen, his face draining of color. The crowd erupted. Barron put his phone away, then took one final step forward. "Now tell me again, Mr. Whitmore, how does your bank plan to move forward?" The man opened his mouth, but this time, his voice wasn't strong. It wasn't dismissive. It wasn't arrogant, it was defeated. And the world knew it. A tense silence gripped the street outside Grand Oaks Bank. The battle of words between Barron Trump and Gerald Whitmore had reached its boiling point, and the weight of accountability finally settled on the arrogant bank director's shoulders. The smugness was gone, replaced by something foreign. Uncertainty. His pride had carried him this far, but now it had turned into his greatest weakness. The crowd sensed it. The power had shifted. With his back against the wall, Whitmore did the only thing a cornered man could do. He surrendered. He adjusted his tie, his fingers trembling slightly, and exhaled through his nose as if trying to steady himself. But there was no saving face here, no brushing this under the rug. He looked around, watching the hundreds of onlookers, still recording, still whispering. His name, his bank, had already become a headline. The moment Barron had shown him the tweet from President Trump, Whitmore knew there was no walking away from this. "Mr. Trump," he finally said, his voice carefully measured, "I acknowledge that mistakes were made today." The crowd murmured, some in disbelief, others in amusement. Even Clint Eastwood raised an eyebrow. "Mistakes?" Barron echoed, his voice cool but firm. "That's an interesting way to put it." Whitmore swallowed hard. "It was never my intention to create a situation like this." Barron took a slow step forward. "Your intention? No. I don't believe your intentions matter much anymore, Mr. Whitmore. What matters is the way people like you treat others when you think no one is watching, when you think no one will hold you accountable." Whitmore's jaw clenched, but he knew he couldn't argue. Clint chuckled under his breath. "Kid, you got him sweating worse than a guilty man in a Western showdown." Barron didn't take his eyes off Whitmore. "Tell me, Mr. Whitmore, how exactly do you plan to fix this?" Whitmore hesitated. The wrong answer could sink him further, but the right one might just let him breathe again. He cleared his throat and turned to the bank manager, who had been standing silently, sweating bullets in the background. "Effective immediately, Grand Oaks Bank will be reviewing all customer service policies, especially regarding our treatment of senior citizens and public figures." A few scattered murmurs ran through the crowd. Barron, however, remained unmoved. "Policy reviews mean nothing without action," he stated, crossing his arms. "Real change is what we're here for." Whitmore grimaced, knowing he was running out of exits. Barron took another step closer, his voice lower now, sharper. "A final warning. Or would you rather wait until your stockholders start pulling their investments? Because I can guarantee that's next." Whitmore went pale. This was no longer just a PR disaster. This was a threat to his power, his reputation, his entire career. He clenched his fists, forced a smile, and nodded. "We'll ensure that what happened today will never happen again," Whitmore finally announced. "Effective immediately, our bank will implement new sensitivity training for all employees. And we will make a donation to a charity supporting senior citizens as a gesture of accountability." The crowd erupted in whispers. The tables had turned completely. Clint Eastwood smirked and leaned toward Barron. "I think you just made this guy regret his entire morning." Barron allowed a small smile but didn't celebrate yet. "How much?" he asked. Whitmore blinked. "Excuse me?" "The donation," Barron clarified, voice calm but unyielding. "How much?" Whitmore hesitated. He knew whatever number he gave, it wouldn't be enough. Barron waited. A beat of silence. Then, finally, Whitmore sighed in defeat. $1 million. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Barron nodded. "Make it 2. Whitmore's eyes widened, but he didn't dare refuse. He nodded stiffly. 2. And just like that, Grand Oaks Bank had just been forced into making the most expensive apology of its existence. Barron extended his hand. Whitmore hesitated, then shook it. The crowd cheered. This wasn't just justice. This was a statement. The air outside Grand Oaks Bank was thick with tension, but the moment Barron Trump secured Whitmore's public apology and forced the bank's commitment to a multi-million-dollar donation, the atmosphere shifted. What had started as an act of arrogance and disrespect had become a national moment of reckoning. The onlookers, who had once been silent bystanders, were now part of something bigger. As the final handshake sealed the deal, a wave of applause rippled through the crowd. Some clapped in relief, others in sheer admiration, but all of them understood they had just witnessed history in the making. The flash of cameras followed immediately after. The media, who had caught wind of the commotion, now swarmed the scene like bees to honey. Reporters pushed forward, microphones extended, desperate to capture the fallout of the now viral incident. "Mr. Trump, what do you have to say about today's events?" a journalist from CNN shouted. Barron, still composed, turned towards the cameras. His blue eyes, sharp and unwavering, met the press without a flicker of hesitation. "Today wasn't about me," he said, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "It was about respect. It was about a man, an American legend, being treated like he was nothing. And if this is how people like Clint Eastwood are treated in public, imagine how the elderly, the veterans, and the everyday citizens who don't have a public platform are treated." The crowd murmured in agreement. Clint Eastwood, who had remained mostly silent during the exchange, nodded approvingly at his godson's words. "Mr. Trump, do you believe this bank should face additional consequences?" another reporter pressed. Barron's lips curled into a knowing smirk. "They already are." The camera crews leaned in closer as Barron gestured toward the crowd, toward the hundreds of onlookers who had their phones out, still recording, still tweeting, still sharing. "This isn't just about a bank anymore," Barron continued. "This is about accountability. And the people," he looked directly into the camera, "the people have spoken." The statement hit like a thunderclap. The internet had already erupted. Within minutes, hashtags like "Respect our elders," "Eastwood deserves better," and "Barron stands for justice" trended across Twitter. The footage of Karen Dawson's slap, Barron's confrontation with Whitmore, and Clint's quiet but powerful presence had already amassed millions of views. News anchors on major networks scrambled to cover the breaking story, dissecting the bigger implications of what had just happened. Fox News anchor Jenna Carter commented, "This isn't just about one incident at a bank. This is a wake-up call for businesses across America about how they treat their customers." Barron Trump's response today sent a message, loud and clear. Meanwhile, on MSNBC, a visibly uncomfortable panel debated whether this moment would increase Barron's already growing political presence. "This young man just handled an entire corporate institution better than most politicians," one commentator noted. "He didn't just demand justice, he delivered it." And then, at the White House, something even bigger happened. Barron's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, and for the first time all day, a flicker of surprise crossed his face. The name, glowing on the screen. "Dad." The entire crowd fell silent as Barron answered. "Hey, Dad." The unmistakable voice of President Donald J. Trump boomed through the speaker, loud enough for the nearby cameras to pick up. "Barron, you handled yourself like a real Trump today, strong, fearless, and always standing up for what's right." A cheer erupted from the crowd. Some clapped, others whistled, and a few even chanted, "Barron, Barron, Barron." The young Trump chuckled, shaking his head. "Just did what needed to be done." The president's voice was full of pride. "You didn't just do what needed to be done, son. You reminded America what real leadership looks like." Barron exhaled, a rare moment of vulnerability crossing his expression. "Thanks, Dad." And just like that, the moment was cemented in history. The streets outside Grand Oaks Bank were still buzzing long after the confrontation had ended. News crews remained stationed near the entrance, eager to capture any final reactions. The crowd that had gathered earlier slowly began dispersing, but the energy in the air was unmistakable. Something had changed. Clint Eastwood stood beside Barron Trump, the young man who had stood up for him in a way that no one had expected. The legend and the rising force, side by side. Clint adjusted his jacket and let out a low chuckle, shaking his head slightly as he stared down the street. Kid, I came here for a few bucks, not to start a revolution. Barron smirked, still scrolling through the endless stream of online reactions on his phone. Guess life had other plans. Clint sighed, glancing at the young Trump. You sure about all this attention? Once something like this gets out, it doesn't just disappear. Barron finally looked up, his eyes clear and steady. Good, because people need to remember this. He turned to face Clint fully, his expression unreadable but powerful. It was never just about you, sir. It was about every person who's ever been dismissed, disrespected, or treated as if they didn't matter. The older man nodded slowly, understanding what Barron meant. This wasn't just an incident. It was a statement, one that echoed far beyond the walls of that bank. As they walked toward the waiting SUV, a group of veterans approached. Their worn faces were filled with emotion. One of them, an older man in a Vietnam veteran cap, stepped forward. His voice was rough but steady. Mr. Eastwood, Mr. Trump, what you did today, it meant something. Clint extended his hand, clasping the veterans in a firm handshake. It's about respect. The veteran turned to Barron, his eyes glistening. Son, your father's a powerful man. But today, you showed the world that power isn't about politics. It's about standing up for what's right. Barron nodded, his expression serious. That's the only kind of power that matters. A moment of silence passed between them before the veteran saluted. Damn right. As Clint and Barron finally stepped into the SUV, the cameras still flashed, the internet still buzzed, and the world was still talking. But inside that car, away from the noise, Clint leaned back in his seat and sighed. You really are your father's son, kid. Barron, gazing out the window at the city skyline, smirked. Maybe, but today I was just a man, doing what needed to be done. And with that, the car pulled away, leaving behind a moment that would never be forgotten. The story of Clint Eastwood's humiliation at Grand Oaks Bank and Barron Trump's powerful intervention is more than just a dramatic encounter. It's a lesson that resonates deeply in today's world. It speaks to something we all witness, but don't always address. The growing lack of respect, the tendency to judge based on appearance, and the failure to recognize the worth of others until it's too late. This wasn't just about an arrogant bank teller or an overconfident bank director. It was about something much bigger. How often do we see people dismissed, ignored, or belittled simply because they don't fit a certain image? The elderly, the working class, the forgotten heroes who built this country. How many times have they been treated as irrelevant just because the world is moving too fast to remember them? What happened in that bank was a wake-up call. It forced everyone in that room, and later the millions who watched the viral footage, to ask themselves an important question. When did we stop valuing people based on their character and start valuing them based on assumptions? Clint Eastwood, a man who has given decades of his life to the film industry, who has inspired generations with his strength, wisdom, and presence, was reduced to just another old man in the eyes of someone who didn't know better. But why did it take Barron Trump's arrival for people to finally recognize his worth? This is a reflection of what's happening in society today. Too many people are judged by what they wear, how they look, or how old they are, rather than by what they've accomplished or the wisdom they carry. Respect should never be conditional. It shouldn't take fame, money, or power for someone to be treated with dignity. And yet, time and again, we see that without those things, people are often cast aside. Barron Trump's response was about more than just defending Clint Eastwood. It was about standing up for a principle that should apply to everyone. No one should have to prove they deserve respect. It should be given freely. The most powerful part of this story wasn't just that Barron Trump stood up for Clint, it was that he didn't have to. He could have walked in, ignored the situation, and gone about his day. But he chose to speak up, and that choice made all the difference. How many times have we witnessed injustice, whether it's an elderly person being ignored, a worker being mistreated, or someone being talked down to, and done nothing? How often do people hesitate because they think, it's not my problem, or someone else will step in? But the truth is, If we don't step in, who will? Standing up for what's right doesn't take power. It takes courage. In today's world where social media and technology dominate, one voice can reach millions. That's exactly what happened with this story. The world saw it, felt it, and reacted to it. And that's proof that the truth still matters. At the heart of this story is a challenge for all of us. Next time you see someone being disrespected, will you step in? Next time you see injustice, will you speak up? Next time you have the chance to show someone kindness, will you take it? Because at the end of the day, true power isn't in money, fame, or position. It's in the simple choices we make every day. To treat others with respect, to defend those who can't defend themselves, and to refuse to be silent in the face of wrongdoing. That's the lesson Barron Trump reminded us of. And that's the lesson that will outlive any viral moment. So, if this story inspired you, don't let it stop here. Like this video if you believe in standing up for what's right. Subscribe to our channel if you want more stories that remind us of the values we should never forget. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this message today. Because the more we spread stories like this, the more we remind the world that respect, integrity, and courage never go out of style. And remember, the strongest people aren't the ones with the loudest voices. They're the ones who stand up, speak out, and make a difference. Just like Barron Trump did that day. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.